January 28th, 1547. The stench of death already hung heavy in the air at Whitehall Palace, though the king still drew breath. Behind closed doors, in chambers where even the bravest courtiers feared to tread, something monstrous was dying. Not just a man, but a legend. Not just a monarch, but a force of nature that had terrorized Europe for nearly 4 decades. The creature that had once been Henry VIII was finally succumbing to a fate more horrific than any of the thousands he had condemned to the scaffold. But this wasn't the peaceful passing of a Christian king. This was the violent, agonizing collapse of a body that had been transformed into something barely human through years of excess, disease, and corruption. What you're about to discover about Henry's final days will shatter everything you thought you knew about Tudor England's most infamous ruler. The official records speak of natural causes and dignified farewells. The reality was a carnival of horrors that would have made his executioner's block seem merciful by comparison. By the winter of 1547, Henry VIII had become a walking nightmare. His massive frame, now approaching 400 pounds, was supported by mechanical devices and carried by teams of servants. The athletic prince who had once dazzled European courts with his prowess in the joust had transformed into a grotesque parody of kingship. His legs, swollen and putrid, wept constantly through bandages that had to be changed multiple times daily. The smell was so overwhelming that courtiers would retch openly in his presence, covering their faces with perfumed handkerchiefs in desperate attempts to mask the stench of royal decay. The king's face, once considered among the handsomest in Christendom, had become a bloated mask of yellowed flesh. His small eyes, now sunken deep into folds of diseased skin, glared out with the paranoid fury that had defined his later years. When he spoke, which was increasingly difficult due to the ulcers that had formed in his throat, his voice emerged as a wet, rasping whisper that sent shivers down the spines of those forced to listen. Modern medical experts believe Henry was suffering from a catastrophic combination of ailments. Type 2 diabetes had ravaged his circulatory system, while chronic osteomyelitis turned his leg bones into rotting timber. The famous ulcers that plagued his final decade were likely the result of this bone infection, creating wounds that would never heal and constantly leaked a mixture of pus and blood that stained everything he touched. But the physical horrors were only part of the nightmare. Henry's mind, once sharp enough to outmaneuver popes and emperors, had begun to fragment under the assault of disease and medication. Court observers noted increasingly erratic behavior. He would fly into murderous rages over imagined slights, ordering executions that his advisors would quietly ignore. In calmer moments, he would weep uncontrollably, calling out for wives long dead or children he had never acknowledged. The king's personal physicians found themselves in an impossible position. Their patient was dying, clearly and obviously, yet they dared not speak this truth aloud. To suggest the king was mortal was tantamount to treason, punishable by the very death they were trying to prevent. Instead, they applied increasingly desperate remedies, each more useless than the last. They burned his flesh with hot irons, hoping to draw out the corruption. They forced him to drink concoctions of powdered unicorn horn and liquid gold. They even applied live pigeons, cut in half, to his festering wounds, believing the warmth might encourage healing. Nothing worked. The king continued his steady descent into a hell of his own making. The political implications of Henry's condition created a crisis that threatened to tear England apart. His son Edward was only 9 years old, far too young to rule in his own right. The boy would need a regency, but who would control it? The conservative Catholic faction, led by the Duke of Norfolk, saw an opportunity to reverse the Protestant reforms that had defined Henry's break with Rome. Meanwhile, the reformist faction, headed by Edward Seymour, the young prince's uncle, was determined to push England even further from Catholic doctrine. Henry, despite his failing faculties, remained acutely aware of these power struggles. In his more lucid moments, he would summon advisors to his bedside, whispering commands and countercommands that often contradicted each other within hours. His signature on official documents became increasingly shaky and illegible, forcing clerks to guide his hand across the parchment while he mumbled incoherently about enemies and conspiracies. The secrecy surrounding the king's condition was absolute and terrifying in its efficiency. Servants who had witnessed his worst episodes would disappear overnight, either reassigned to remote castles or simply vanishing from the historical record entirely. The official court bulletins continued to describe Henry as robust and active, even as he lay dying in rooms that reeked of decay and despair. Those few who were permitted access to the royal presence described scenes that belonged in a medieval vision of purgatory. The king's bed, specially reinforced to support his enormous weight, was surrounded by burning braziers that failed to mask the smell of rotting flesh. Religious relics and Protestant prayer books lay scattered across tables, evidence of Henry's desperate attempts to secure divine favor from whichever god might still listen to his pleas. The psychological torment may have been worse than the physical agony. Henry had spent his reign convinced of his divine right to rule, believing that God himself had placed the crown upon his head. Now, as his body betrayed him in the most humiliating ways possible, he was forced to confront the possibility that his suffering was punishment for the thousands of lives he had destroyed in pursuit of power. Court records, written in careful code to avoid accusations of treason, describe Henry calling out in his sleep for victims of his reign. He would scream the names of Thomas More, John Fisher, and countless others who be brought to his bedside. Becoming violent, he would demand that long-dead wives had died rather than bend to his will. Sometimes when told they could not comply, in his most disturbed moments, he would claim to see their ghosts standing at the foot of his bed, silently judging the tyrant who had destroyed them. The winter of 1547 brought an acceleration of Henry's decline that terrified even his most hardened courtiers. His episodes of rage became shorter but more violent, followed by periods of complete unconsciousness that left observers wondering if each breath might be his last. His skin took on a greyish pallor that made him appear already dead, while his breathing became laboured and irregular. The king's appetite, once legendary throughout Europe, had completely disappeared. Food would be brought to his chambers and removed untouched, as Henry claimed that everything tasted of metal and decay. When he did attempt to eat, he would immediately vomit, bringing up blood and bile that stained his bedclothes and filled the air with an even more nauseating stench. As January progressed toward its end, the death watch began in earnest. Archbishop Cranmer was summoned to remain close to the palace, ready to administer last rites when the moment finally arrived. The Privy Council met in continuous session, preparing for the transition of power, while maintaining the fiction that their king remained healthy and alert. But Henry VIII was far from finished with his subjects. Even as death approached, he had one final performance to give, one last demonstration of the absolute power that had defined his reign. What happened in those final hours would prove that even in extremis, the most dangerous place in England remained within arm's reach of the dying king. The final week of January brought horrors that would have challenged the imagination of Dante himself. Henry's body had begun to betray him in ways that defied medical understanding, even by the crude standards of Tudor medicine. His skin, once pale but healthy, had developed a network of dark veins that spread across his torso, like the roots of some malevolent tree. Where these veins intersected, boils would anything in their experience. The king's legendary form and burst, releasing fluids that physicians described as unlike temper, already made unpredictable by pain and medication, now manifested in episodes that bordered on supernatural fury. During one particularly violent outburst on January 22nd, Henry reportedly threw a heavy silver goblet with such force that it shattered against the stone wall, leaving a dent that would remain visible for decades. The effort left him gasping and convulsing, his massive frame shaking the specially reinforced bed until servants feared it might collapse entirely. What made these episodes even more terrifying was their unpredictability. One moment Henry would be screaming about perceived betrayals and demanding immediate executions. The next he would fall silent and stare at empty corners of the room with an expression of absolute terror. When questioned about what he saw, he would only whisper about shadows that moved without light and voices that spoke in languages older than England itself. The king's personal servants, those brave or desperate enough to maintain their positions, began reporting phenomena that challenged their understanding of the natural world. Henry's body temperature would fluctuate wildly, burning with fever 1 hour and cold as winter stone the next. His pulse would race so fast that physicians could barely count it, then slow to such a crawl that they would lean close to his chest, fearing he had already passed. Most disturbing were the sounds that emanated from the royal chambers during the darkest hours of night. Guards stationed outside would hear what they described as multiple voices coming from within, though they knew only the dying king occupied the room. Some swore they heard conversations in languages they couldn't identify, while others reported hearing Henry speaking in the voices of people they knew to be long dead. The political machinery of England continued to function around this nightmare, but cracks were beginning to show. Ambassadors from foreign courts noted the unusual restrictions on access to the king, while English nobles found themselves summoned to audiences that would be cancelled at the last moment without explanation. The careful choreography of Tudor court life was breaking down as the central figure around which it all revolved descended deeper into his personal hell. Edward Seymour, soon to be Duke of Somerset and Lord Protector, began making increasingly bold moves to consolidate power around young Prince Edward. Secret meetings were held in chambers far from the king's quarters, where whispered discussions of the future took place while the present king rotted in his bed. These conspirators walked a knife's edge, knowing that discovery would mean immediate execution if Henry still possessed enough lucidity to comprehend their treachery. The Duke of Norfolk, Henry's former brother-in-law and longtime survivor of court intrigue, found himself outmaneuvered by younger, more desperate men. His arrest on charges of treason had been ordered by the dying king in one of his final coherent moments, though the execution would be delayed by Henry's death. Norfolk's downfall served as a final reminder that proximity to Henry VIII remained lethal, even as the king himself lay dying. Religious tensions reached a fevered pitch as different factions attempted to influence Henry's final spiritual preparations. Catholic sympathizers smuggled rosaries and holy relics into his chambers, hoping to secure a deathbed conversion that might legitimize their cause. Protestant reformers countered with carefully selected Bible passages and reformed prayer books, determined to ensure their king died in the faith he had helped establish. Henry himself seemed torn between these competing visions of salvation. In his more lucid moments, he would alternate between demanding Catholic last rites and Protestant prayers, as if hoping that divine favor might be secured through sheer volume of religious observance. His personal chaplains found themselves caught in an impossible position, trying to minister to a soul that seemed to exist in multiple theological states simultaneously. The physical deterioration accelerated dramatically as January 27th dawned. Henry's famous appetite for life, which had once encompassed everything from warfare to music to the pursuit of wives, had been reduced to a desperate hunger for air. Each breath became a conscious effort, a battle against the corruption that was consuming him from within. His chest would rise and fall in irregular patterns that left observers wondering if each exhalation might be his last. The king's hands, once strong enough to draw the most powerful longbows in England, had become twisted claws that could barely grip the bedsheets. His fingers, swollen and discolored, would scratch constantly at his skin, leaving bloody furrows that refused to heal. When servants attempted to restrain these movements, Henry would summon reserves of strength that seemed impossible given his condition, fighting them off with the fury of a cornered animal. As the hours passed, Henry's connection to the world around him became increasingly tenuous. He would speak to people who weren't present, hold conversations with empty air, and react with terror to things that existed only in his diseased mind. The boundary between life and death, between sanity and madness, between king and monster, had become so blurred that even those closest to him struggled to recognize the man they had once feared above all others. The final act of this royal tragedy was about to begin, and it would prove that even in death, Henry VIII remained capable of inspiring fear, revulsion, and a kind of awful fascination that would echo through the centuries. The creature that had once been England's most powerful king was preparing for an exit that would be remembered as one of history's most grotesque spectacles of mortality and power. The morning of January 28th brought with it an eerie stillness that seemed to settle over Whitehall Palace like a burial shroud. The usual sounds of court life, the clatter of servants, the murmur of courtiers, the distant calls of guards, had been replaced by an oppressive quiet that made even the bravest souls speak in whispers. Inside the royal chambers, the dying king had entered what would prove to be his final battle, not against foreign enemies or rebellious nobles, but against the very essence of mortality itself. Henry's breathing had become a grotesque symphony of wet, rattling sounds that echoed through the stone corridors, despite the heavy tapestries meant to muffle them. Each inhalation seemed to require enormous effort, his massive chest heaving like a bellows worked by exhausted hands. The exhalations came in shuddering gasps that sprayed droplets of blood-tinged foam across the silk pillows that surrounded his head like a macabre halo. The king's eyes, when they opened at all, had taken on a glassy quality that suggested he was seeing things far beyond the confines of his chamber. Sometimes he would track movement that wasn't there, following invisible figures with his gaze as they apparently moved around his bed. Other times he would stare fixedly at the ceiling, his lips moving in silent conversation with entities that existed only in his failing mind. Dr. William Butts, Henry's longtime physician, had exhausted every remedy known to Tudor medicine, and several that existed only in the darkest corners of alchemical theory. Potions made from crushed pearls and liquid mercury had been forced down the king's throat. Amulets containing the ground bones of saints had been placed around his neck. Even stranger preparations had been attempted, concoctions involving the blood of virgin martyrs and powders made from meteorites that had fallen from heaven itself. Nothing had any effect beyond adding to Henry's torment. The physician's notes, written in a trembling hand that betrayed his own terror, described symptoms that seemed to defy natural law. The king's pulse would sometimes stop entirely for minutes at a time, only to resume with violent irregularity. His body temperature would shift so dramatically that frost would form on his skin, even as sweat poured from his brow. Most disturbing of all were the moments when Henry's body would contort into positions that should have been impossible, given the limitations of human anatomy. The political vultures circling outside the royal chambers could sense that the end was approaching, with the predatory instincts that had kept them alive in the treacherous world of Tudor court politics. Edward Seymour had positioned his allies throughout the palace, ready to move the moment Henry drew his last breath. Secret messages flew between conspirators who communicated in codes that would have made professional spies envious. The future of England was being decided in whispered conversations, while its present king lay dying in agony mere rooms away. Thomas Cranmer, the Archbishop of Canterbury, had been summoned to provide spiritual comfort to the dying monarch, but even this seasoned clergyman found himself shaken by what he witnessed. Henry's relationship with divine authority had always been complex, shaped by his break with Rome and his establishment of himself as head of the English Church. Now, facing judgment himself, the king seemed desperate to hedge his spiritual bets through any means necessary. In moments of clarity, Henry would demand Protestant prayers, insisting that salvation came through faith alone and rejecting the Catholic practices he had spent years dismantling. But as pain overwhelmed his rational mind, He would beg for Catholic last rites, pleading for the intercession of saints he had officially declared powerless. This theological whiplash created impossible situations for those trying to minister to him, as they struggled to determine which version of Henry's religious convictions represented his true final wishes. The king's famous paranoia had reached new heights of intensity as death approached. He would suddenly accuse longtime servants of poisoning him, demanding their immediate execution with the same fury that had once terrorized his court. When told that these people were not present, Henry would insist they were hiding in the shadows, watching him with malevolent intent. His accusations grew increasingly bizarre, encompassing not just living enemies, but long-dead rivals who he claimed were returning from hell to claim him. Anne Boleyn featured prominently in these delirious accusations. Henry would scream that she was standing at the foot of his bed, her severed head tucked under her arm, demanding an accounting for the daughter he had declared illegitimate. He would thrash weakly at empty air, trying to strike at phantoms that existed only in his guilt-ridden imagination. Sometimes he would weep and beg her forgiveness. Other times he would rage about her supposed infidelities, as if the events of over a decade past were happening again in real time. The physical decay had progressed to a point where even the most hardened court physicians struggled to maintain their composure. The king's skin had begun to slough off in places, leaving raw patches that wept constantly. The famous leg ulcers had grown so large and deep that bone was visible in several places, while the smell had become so overwhelming that braziers burning exotic spices and herbs could no longer mask it effectively. Henry's hair, once a glorious auburn crown that had made him the envy of European royalty, had fallen out in great clumps, leaving his scalp covered in angry red sores that refused to heal. His teeth, already blackened and loose from years of sugar consumption and poor hygiene, had begun falling out entirely, making his speech even more difficult to understand. When he did manage to speak coherently, his words were often sprayed with blood and fragments of decaying tooth. The king's legendary appetite had transformed into something almost supernatural in its absence. Food would be brought to his chamber and removed untouched, as Henry claimed that everything tasted of grave dirt and corruption. On the rare occasions when he could be convinced to take even small amounts of nourishment, he would immediately vomit it back up along with quantities of blood and bile that seemed impossible given his reduced food intake. Sleep, when it came at all, brought no relief from his torment. Henry's dreams were apparently filled with the ghosts of his victims, as he would cry out in terror, calling for mercy from people he had shown none to in life. Thomas More's name was frequently heard echoing from the royal chambers during the darkest hours of night, along with those of countless other nobles, monks, and common subjects who had fallen victim to his reign of terror. The king's servants had developed a rotation system to minimize their exposure to the horrors of attending him. Even the most loyal retainers could only endure limited time in his presence before being overwhelmed by the combination of physical revulsion and psychological terror that accompanied proximity to the dying monarch. Those who had served him longest were often the most affected, as they struggled to reconcile the vital, charismatic king they had once known with the nightmare creature he had become. Foreign ambassadors stationed at the English court began sending increasingly urgent dispatches to their home countries, though they were forced to write in careful euphemisms to avoid accusations of spreading rumors about the king's health. The Venetian representative wrote of a great change in the royal demeanor, while the French ambassador reported circumstances of unusual gravity surrounding His Majesty's person. These coded messages barely hinted at the true horror unfolding within the palace walls. As January 28th wore on, it became increasingly clear that Henry's long reign of terror was finally approaching its end. But even in his extremity, the king retained enough of his old cunning to orchestrate one final act of political theatre that would demonstrate his absolute power over life and death. The last signature he would affix to an official document would condemn yet another victim to the scaffold, proving that Henry VIII remained dangerous until his very last breath. The final hours were approaching, and with them would come revelations about the true cost of absolute power, the price of tyranny, and the horrible justice that awaited those who had lived by the sword. The monster that had once been England's golden prince was preparing for an exit that would be remembered as one of history's most fitting and terrible conclusions to a reign built on blood, fear, and the systematic destruction of human dignity. And so, at 3 in the morning on January 28, 1547, the nightmare finally ended. Henry VIII, the king who had reshaped England through sheer force of will and terror, drew his last tortured breath in a chamber that reeked of death and divine judgment. His grotesque end served as a final testament to the terrible price of absolute power. The athletic prince, who had once embodied Renaissance glory, died as a rotting monument to human corruption. The tyrant, who had sent thousands to their deaths, discovered that even kings must eventually face a judgment they cannot escape, appeal, or terrify into submission.